So now I've got the A7IV on the 400 G Master f2.8, trying to capture some surfers. So let's get into it.
So I wanted to make something pretty interesting today and take advantage of the pretty poor weather outside. It's been raining for the last week and, you know, rain looks good in slow motion. So I wanted to compare the A7IV slow motion to the FX3 slow motion. Now we know that the FX3 does 4K, 100 frames per second, 10-bit 422, whereas the A7IV can only do 1080p at 100 frames per second. But if you shoot in S&Q mode, you can get 10-bit 422 out of this thing. It is a lower bit rate, it's only like 93 megabits per second, whereas this is like 280 megabits per second. So there is a pretty big difference between the two cameras. And we all know that 4K looks much better than 1080, specifically if you are on a bigger screen, you can notice that resolution. That's what we're actually going to be discussing today is, you know, will you actually get away with just using the A7IV in 1080, or would you actually need the FX3 or A7S3 and get 4K 100 frames per second? So if we are talking about these two cameras, we're going to have to talk about the specifications because they do have different sensors. The A7IV has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor that spits out a 4K image that's downsampled from 7K. If you do switch it to 4K 60, it goes into 1.5 crop, and then you have to use 1080p to get full frame 100 frames per second with 422 10-bit. The FX3 is part of Sony's cinema line cameras and sports a 12 megapixel full frame sensor. It can spit out 4K at 100 frames per second with 422 10-bit color. And it has a really fast sensor readout and great rolling shutter performance, which can make it desirable for a whole bunch of different applications, especially sports and wildlife. Now, just before we head out into the rain, we're going to be shooting just a little bit on the lens chart because then we can actually see exactly how sharp this is going to be and the differences between the two cameras. But, you know, that obviously doesn't translate into the real world. So that's why we're going to be doing both lens chart, real world. Let's get into it. So this is the FX3 at 4K at 100 frames per second. We zoom into the center and you can see it is nice and tack sharp and good contrast. Now we go over to the A7IV. This is 1080p at 100 frames per second and we zoom into the center and you can see there is a clear and obvious difference between the FX3 and the A7IV. Now this is comparing the 1080p in the A7IV and the 4K at 100 frames per second in the FX3. So we're out in the park here. I've got the ECM B10 on top of the A7IV and we're going to be comparing the A7IV 1080 at 100 frames per second versus the FX6 at 100 frames per second but in 4K. It's not cropped, so they're both full frame, but we're going to be really seeing the quality difference between these two cameras. So what do you think? Yeah, is there going to be a quality difference between the A7IV and the FX3? Do you reckon? There is. Well, you heard it from Azalea. So the rain still seems to be going here in Brisbane, but down on the Gold Coast it says it's not raining, but it is cloudy. But I want to film some surfers, so we'll grab the big 400mm G Master lens and head down there. Let's go.
So I thought, hey, why not? Let's throw the Sony ZV-E10 on the giant 400mm G Master f2.8 and see what it looks like. Now, you've probably noticed by now there is a fairly big difference between the 4K and 1080p, but yeah, you can see we are here in a theme park in the Gold Coast, and we're going to be testing out on these rides here, and thought, yeah, why not? We may as well see what it looks like in slow motion.
So it's come to the part of the video where I've got to give my overall opinion on both of these cameras. Now, if you are a working professional, it is a pretty much no-brainer that you will choose the FX3. It's just got absolutely everything you need when it comes to image quality and performance. But there comes a caveat. If you're not using slow motion, 60 frames, 120 frames, whatever it is in slow motion, and you are only just using 4K, 24, 25, and 30, the A7IV is actually a really good deal. That's pretty much why I bought it over the FX3 or the A7S3. But I do have the FX6, so I didn't need the 4K 100 frames per second because I've got it in that. So I thought I'd have a different sensor just to play with, something a little bit of a different look. But long story short, the A7IV is still a really good camera, but when it comes to that slow motion, the FX3 is an absolute no-brainer. It's a fabulous camera when it comes to image quality and performance. 4K 60, 4K 120 is just buttery smooth. You can't compare it to 1080p because there is a big difference. Sure, when it comes to the higher end cinema cameras like ARRI cameras, they've been doing 1080p for absolutely forever and the image quality is incredible, but that's a whole nother topic on its own. When it comes to the A7IV versus the FX3, the clear winner is FX3, but you can still get away with brilliant image quality and performance when it comes to the A7IV in 1080p because it's still got 10-bit 422. That is great. It's really good feature, especially compared to the older A7 III or A7C where it's only 8-bit. So S-Log3 does become much more usable in this instance. But if you are a working professional, obviously I do recommend the FX3. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. It'd be absolutely amazing. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.